The morning sun barely broke through the thick jungle canopy when Sergeant Marcus Thompson pressed his face against the muddy edge of the trench. 3 days. 3 long days of hell on a tiny island whose name most Americans back home could not even pronounce. The year was 1944, and the Pacific War had turned every small piece of land into a battlefield where men fought and died for strategic positions that looked like nothing more than jungle and rock. Mac wiped the sweat from his forehead and glanced at the men around him. Corporal Jimmy Hayes sat with his back against the trench wall, his rifle across his lap, eyes closed but not sleeping. Private Rodriguez cleaned his weapon for the 10th time that morning, his hands shaking slightly. Young Private Chun, barely 19 years old, stared at the bandage on his arm where a sniper's bullet had grazed him yesterday. 2 other wounded men had been evacuated during the night, crawling through the mud to reach the medical station 500 yards behind their position. The problem was simple but deadly. Japanese snipers had surrounded their outpost. Nobody knew how many. Maybe 5, maybe 15. They were invisible, hidden somewhere in the dense tropical forest that surrounded the American position on 3 sides. Every time someone raised their head above the trench line, a shot rang out. Sometimes the bullet found its target. Sometimes it missed by inches. But the message was always clear. Movement means death. Mac had been in the Pacific Theater for 18 months. He had seen action in the Solomon Islands and survived the brutal fighting in New Guinea. He knew the Japanese soldiers were skilled, disciplined, and willing to die for their emperor. Their snipers were among the best in the world, trained to wait for hours without moving, to shoot from positions so well camouflaged that American forces often never found them, even after battles ended. The strategic situation was frustrating. Mac's squad had orders to hold this position for 2 more days until reinforcements could arrive with supplies and fresh troops. Command had bigger problems elsewhere on the island. A major Japanese counterattack was expected on the eastern shore, and every available man was needed there. Mac's 12 soldiers were considered expendable if it meant holding the larger defensive line. But Mac did not feel expendable. Neither did his men. They had families back home, dreams of returning to normal lives, plans for futures that felt increasingly uncertain with each passing hour. During the previous night, Mac had used a periscope made from a broken mirror and some wire to observe the jungle. The device let him see over the trench without exposing his head. What he noticed gave him an idea, though at first he dismissed it as desperate and foolish. The sniper shot at everything. A helmet raised on a stick for just a second had drawn fire. A piece of cloth waved above the trench had been hit twice. Even a canteen reflecting sunlight had attracted a bullet. The enemy shooters were patient, but they also seemed eager to take any shot that presented itself. They did not wait to confirm their targets were real soldiers. This made sense from a military perspective. In jungle warfare, targets appeared and disappeared in seconds. A sniper who hesitated might miss his only chance for hours. The Japanese doctrine emphasized aggression and seizing opportunities. Their snipers were trained to shoot first and trust their instincts. Mac understood something else too. The snipers had limited ammunition. Every soldier in the Pacific knew about supply problems. The American submarines had devastated Japanese shipping lanes. Islands like this one were cut off, receiving supplies only by occasional nighttime barge runs that American aircraft hunted relentlessly. Those snipers hiding in the jungle probably had strict orders to conserve ammunition, but their tactical situation forced them to shoot whenever they thought they had a target. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose into the 90s, Mac made his decision. He crawled along the trench to where Jimmy Saturday. "I need the broomstick from the supply hut," Mac said quietly. Jimmy opened his eyes and looked at his sergeant with confusion. "The what?" "There's an old broomstick in that abandoned hut 20 yards behind us. I saw it 2 days ago. I need it." "Mac, you planning to sweep the trench? Because I gotta tell you, cleanliness ain't our biggest problem right now." Mac smiled despite the situation. Jimmy had been his friend since basic training in Texas, a country boy from Oklahoma with a talent for finding humor in terrible circumstances. "Just get it for me. Stay low. Move during the next cloud cover." 20 minutes later, Jimmy returned with the broomstick. crawling on his belly through the mud. He also brought Mac's spare helmet, the one that had been sitting in his pack since they landed on the island. Mac took both items and began working. He used some wire to attach the helmet firmly to the top of the broomstick. Then he stuffed some cloth underneath the helmet to create a shape that might look like shoulders and a neck from a distance. The other soldiers watched with growing curiosity. "Sarge has finally lost it," Rodriguez muttered. "Maybe," said Chun. "Or maybe he's smarter than all of us." Mac ignored them. He positioned himself at a spot in the trench that offered good cover and a clear view of the jungle ahead. Then, very slowly, he raised the broomstick until the helmet appeared above the trench line. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The jungle was silent except for the distant calls of tropical birds and the buzzing of insects. Mac held the broomstick steady, his heart pounding. Then came the crack of a rifle shot. The helmet jerked violently as a bullet punched through the metal with a sharp ping. Mac pulled the broomstick down and examined the damage. A clean hole through the front of the helmet, slightly off-center. He looked at Jimmy and grinned. "Told you it would work." "Work? Mac, they just destroyed your helmet." "Exactly," Mac said. "And that's one bullet they won't be using on us." The afternoon heat turned the trench into an oven. Mac moved to a different position, 10 feet to the left of where he had raised the helmet the first time. The other soldiers had stopped questioning his sanity and now watched with intense interest. Rodriguez had even started taking notes on a piece of paper he kept in his pocket, marking down the time and location of each shot. Mac raised the helmet again, this time letting it show for a full minute. He moved it slightly from side to side, creating the impression of a soldier scanning the jungle. The response came quickly. Another crack, another bullet hole. This shot came from a different angle than the first, hitting the helmet from the right side instead of straight on. "That's two different shooters," Jimmy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or one sniper who moved real fast." "Two shooters," Mac confirmed. He pulled out a piece of charcoal from his pack and made marks on the trench wall, drawing rough lines that showed the angles of the incoming fire. "The first shot came from that direction, maybe 200 yards out. This second one is closer, maybe 150 yards, but over there to the east." The tactical picture was becoming clearer. The Japanese had positioned their snipers in a semicircle around the American position, each covering a different field of fire. It was a classic isolation strategy used throughout the Pacific War. The snipers would pin down enemy forces while preventing reinforcement or escape. Sometimes they would maintain these positions for days, living in the trees or in carefully constructed hide sites, eating cold rice and drinking rainwater while they waited for targets to be. Why mid-afternoon, Mac had raised the helmet 12 times from different positions along the trench. Each time, a shot rang out within seconds. The helmet now looked like Swiss cheese, riddled with holes that let sunlight pass through. But more importantly, Mac had mapped the locations of at least 6 different sniper positions. Some had fired multiple times. Others had only shot once before going silent, perhaps repositioning or perhaps simply conserving ammunition. The mood in the trench had changed completely. The men no longer felt like helpless targets. They were gathering intelligence, turning the tables on their invisible enemy. Even young Chun, who had been terrified since getting wounded, now volunteered to hold the broomstick for Mac while the sergeant drew more detailed maps. "How many bullets do you think they got?" Rodriguez asked during a brief break. He was drinking from his canteen, rationing the warm water carefully. Mac considered the question. "Standard Japanese sniper loadout is about 60 rounds for their Arisaka rifles. But supply lines are bad for them right now. Naval intelligence says American subs have been sinking almost everything trying to reach these islands. These snipers might have half that number, maybe less." This was the brutal mathematics of the Pacific War in 1944. Japan was an island nation that depended entirely on ships to supply its scattered garrisons across thousands of miles of ocean. The United States had built hundreds of submarines specifically to cut those supply lines. By this point in the war, Japanese forces on isolated islands were slowly starving and running out of ammunition. Some units had been reduced to fighting with improvised weapons and expired rations. But hungry, desperate soldiers were often more dangerous, not less. Mac knew this. The Japanese troops had orders to fight to the death rather than surrender. Their military culture considered surrender the ultimate dishonor. This meant every battle in the Pacific was a fight to the finish, with no quarter asked or given on either side. As the sun began to drop toward the horizon, Mac prepared for another test. This time he added a wrinkle to his deception. He found a spare canteen and tied it to the broomstick just below the helmet. When he raised the assembly, the metal canteen caught the fading sunlight and flashed brightly. The response was immediate and dramatic. 3 shots in rapid succession, all from different directions. One hit the helmet, one hit the canteen with a loud clang, and one buried itself in the dirt of the trench wall. "They really hate that canteen," Jimmy said, flinching at the sudden barrage. Mac nodded thoughtfully. "Shiny objects. Probably think it's binoculars or a scope. High-value target." He made more marks on his map, noting the new firing positions. The picture was nearly complete now. The Japanese had at least 8 snipers in the jungle, arranged in 2 rough lines. The first line was closer, maybe 100 to 150 yards out. The second line was further back, providing covering fire and backup positions. As darkness approached, Mac called his men together for a briefing. They huddled at the bottom of the trench while the last light faded from the sky. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the tropical night. "Here's what we know," Mac said, pointing to his crude map. 8 confirmed sniper positions, maybe more. They're burning through ammunition, shooting at our decoy. By my count, they fired at least 20 rounds at the helmet today. 20 rounds they can't use on us, Chen added, his voice stronger now than it had been that morning. "Exactly. Tomorrow we do this bigger. I want every squad along this line to make their own decoys. Broomsticks, sticks, whatever works. We coordinate the timing. We make them shoot at ghosts all day long." Rodriguez raised a concern. "What if they figure it out? What if they stop shooting? Then we've still won," Mac explained. "Because if they stop shooting, they stop controlling this position. We can move, we can improve our defenses, we can prepare for the reinforcements. Either way, their advantage disappears." The logic was sound. In warfare, psychological advantage often mattered as much as bullets and bombs. The Japanese snipers had controlled this position through fear and uncertainty. Mac's simple trick was breaking that control, round by wasted round. That night, Mac lay in the trench and stared at the stars. He thought about his grandfather's stories from World War I. Tales of trench warfare in France where soldiers had used dummy heads to draw fire from German snipers. Old tactics for a new war. Sometimes the simplest solutions were the best. Tomorrow they would make those snipers regret every shot they had taken at a piece of metal on a stick. Dawn broke with unexpected violence. Mac woke to the sound of artillery fire in the distance. Miles away toward the eastern shore where American intelligence had predicted the Japanese counterattack. The ground trembled slightly with each explosion, a reminder that their small battle with snipers was just one tiny piece of a much larger war, the WWII 600 hours. Mac had visited 3 other squad positions along the defensive line. Word of his helmet trick had spread during the night. Soldiers were eager to try anything that might improve their situation. Within an hour, a dozen makeshift decoys had been constructed using helmets, sticks, branches, and whatever materials the men could scavenge. Lieutenant Morrison, the young officer commanding their section, had initially been skeptical. He was fresh from officers' training school in California, educated in tactics, but lacking field experience. However, when Mac showed him the map of sniper positions and explained the ammunition depletion strategy, Morrison saw the value. He authorized the coordinated deception plan and even contributed his own spare helmet to the effort. The operation began at 0700 hours. Along 200 yards of American defensive line, helmets began appearing above trenches and behind sandbags. The Japanese response was immediate and sustained. The jungle erupted with gunfire. Crack, crack, crack. The distinctive sound of Arisaka rifles echoed through the morning air. Bullets whined overhead and thudded into earth, wood, and metal. Mac watched through his periscope as the enemy snipers fell for the trap again and again. Some shots were careful and aimed. Others seemed rushed, almost desperate. He realized the snipers were under pressure from their own commanders to produce results, to justify their positions and ammunition expenditure. This was the nature of the Pacific War in 1944. Both sides were under enormous pressure. For the Americans, every island had to be taken to establish airfields and bases for the eventual invasion of Japan. For the Japanese, every island had to be held to delay that invasion and buy time for a negotiated peace. Neither side could afford to show weakness. Neither side could afford to waste resources. By mid-morning, the sound of sniper fire had become almost constant. Rodriguez kept count using hash marks on his paper. When he reached 30 marks, he showed it to Mac with wide eyes. 30 rounds in 3 hours, Sarge. This is working. But Mac noticed something troubling. Not all the helmets were being targeted equally. The snipers seemed to be learning, becoming more selective. They focused fire on decoys that showed more realistic movement or appeared in positions that made tactical sense. The completely stationary helmets were being ignored. Mac adapted quickly. He showed the other soldiers how to add subtle movement to their decoys. A slight sway, as if someone was breathing. A slow side-to-side motion, as if scanning the jungle. Even tying a string to the helmet and pulling it gently to create the impression of a soldier ducking and rising. The improved deceptions brought renewed enemy fire. The snipers could not afford to ignore what might be real targets. In jungle warfare, hesitation meant failure. A soldier who appeared for 3 seconds and then disappeared might not show himself again for hours. The snipers had to shoot at anything that looked remotely human. Around noon, the situation changed dramatically. An American observation plane flew overhead, a small single-engine scout aircraft that had taken off from a carrier somewhere over the horizon. The plane circled the area for 10 minutes, low enough that Mac could see the pilot in the cockpit. The Japanese snipers made a fatal mistake. Several of them fired at the plane, trying to hit the pilot or damage the engine. The plane was too high and moving too fast to be in real danger. But those shots revealed sniper positions that had remained hidden until now. Mac and the other soldiers marked the muzzle flashes carefully. When the plane finally flew away, they had identified 4 new enemy positions. Lieutenant Morrison used this information immediately. He called in coordinates to the artillery battery station 2 miles behind their position. Within 20 minutes, shells began falling on the suspected sniper locations. The explosions tore through the jungle, splintering trees and throwing up geysers of dirt and vegetation. The sniper fire decreased noticeably after the barrage ended, but the Japanese were resilient and well-trained. By mid-afternoon, the surviving snipers had repositioned and resumed their harassment fire. However, Mac noticed their shooting was less aggressive now, more cautious. They were running low on ammunition, just as he had predicted. As the day wore on, Mac got more creative with his deceptions. He created a scene using 3 helmets at different heights, arranged to look like soldiers having a conversation. He added pieces of uniform to suggest bodies below the helmets. He even used a small mirror to reflect sunlight occasionally, mimicking the flash from binoculars or a watch face. Each elaboration drew fire. The snipers seemed unable to resist what looked like multiple targets presenting themselves carelessly. In their position, hidden in the jungle with limited intelligence about American strength, they had to assume every helmet represented a real soldier. The alternative was to stop shooting entirely and lose all tactical effectiveness. Young Chun had a close call around 1,500 hours. Excited by the success of the decoys, he raised his head too quickly to look at the jungle without checking first. A bullet cracked past his ear, so close he felt the pressure wave. He dropped back into the trench, his face pale, his hands shaking. Mac pulled him aside and spoke quietly but firmly. The trick only works if we stay disciplined. The helmet goes up first. Always. You check with the periscope. You never, ever assume you're safe just because things are going well. Understood? Chen nodded, too shaken to speak. The incident reminded all of them that this was still a deadly game. The snipers might be wasting ammunition, but their remaining bullets were just as lethal as the first ones they had fired. As the sun began setting on their second day of deception, Rodriguez completed his count. 63 confirmed shots at decoys. Mack estimated they had missed counting at least 10 more during the artillery barrage and the confusion after Chen's close call. The snipers had probably fired 75 to 80 rounds at fake targets. Tomorrow the reinforcements would arrive. Tomorrow this nightmare would end. Tonight they would maintain watch and pray the snipers' ammunition ran out before their own luck did. The third morning arrived with an eerie silence that made Mack more nervous than the constant gunfire had. He raised the helmet decoy at 0630 hours from the same position that had drawn immediate fire the previous 2 days. Nothing happened. He waited 2 full minutes. Still nothing. He tried a different position. No response. Jimmy crawled over to Mack's position, concern written across his face. They stopped shooting. That's good, right? Maybe, Mack said cautiously. Or maybe they're out of ammunition and desperate. A desperate enemy is the most dangerous kind. Mack had learned this lesson during his time in the Pacific. The Battle of Tarawa in late 1943 had been a bloodbath partly because Japanese defenders, knowing they were doomed, had fought with suicidal fury. The Battle of Saipan earlier in 1944 had ended with massive banzai charges when the defenders ran out of options. Soldiers who accepted death as inevitable would take terrible risks to inflict maximum damage before the end. Around 0800 hours, one of the snipers fired a single shot at a helmet decoy. Just one shot, then silence again. Mack noted the position. It was one of the locations from the first day, meaning that sniper had stayed in place for 3 days straight. The level of discipline required for that was remarkable and frightening. Lieutenant Morrison gathered the squad leaders for a brief meeting at 0900 hours. The reinforcements were confirmed to arrive by 1400 hours, just 5 hours away. Morrison's orders were clear: maintain defensive positions, continue the decoy operations but with extreme caution, and under no circumstances attempt any aggressive action against the snipers. But Mack had other ideas. He had spent 3 days mapping enemy positions. He had watched their patterns, understood their tactics, and seen their discipline begin to crack. The information he had gathered was too valuable to waste. During the meeting, he requested permission to call in artillery strikes on the most threatening sniper positions. Morrison hesitated. He was young, inexperienced, and afraid of making mistakes. But he was also smart enough to listen to his sergeants. After 5 minutes of discussion, he agreed. Mack would coordinate with the artillery battery to deliver precision strikes on 3 specific locations where snipers had fired most frequently. The artillery bombardment began at 1030 hours. Mack had marked the coordinates carefully using his maps and the angles of fire he had documented. The first shells landed 200 yards into the jungle, exactly where Mack had estimated one of the primary sniper positions to be. Trees exploded into splinters. The ground shook. Even from their trench, the Americans could feel the blast waves. 3 more volleys followed, targeting the other marked positions. The jungle became an inferno of explosions and flying debris. After 10 minutes, the guns fell silent. Smoke rose from multiple locations in the forest. Small fires burned where the shells had landed. For 2 hours, no sniper fire came from a jungle. Mack began to hope they had eliminated the threat entirely. But at 1245 hours, just 75 minutes before the reinforcements were due to arrive, the situation changed dramatically. A single shot cracked out from a new position, much closer than any previous sniper location. The bullet struck the trench wall inches from Rodriguez's head, showering him with dirt. Before anyone could react, 2 more shots followed from different angles. The Japanese snipers had moved during the night and after the artillery barrage, establishing new positions much nearer to the American line. They're trying to do maximum damage before we get reinforced, Mack shouted to his men. Everybody down. No heroics. But the snipers had changed their tactics. Instead of waiting for targets, they were firing suppressing shots into the American positions, trying to force mistakes or lucky hits. Bullets whined overhead constantly. The defenders could not raise their heads, could not return fire, could not even use the periscope without risk. Mack realized the enemy snipers were sacrificing their remaining ammunition in a final desperate attack. They knew the Americans would be reinforced soon. This was their last chance to inflict casualties and justify their mission. It was a calculated gamble based on warrior pride and military necessity. The assault continued for 20 minutes. Mac counted at least 30 shots, more concentrated fire than they had faced in the previous 3 days combined. One bullet found Private Chin's canteen, puncturing it and spilling water across the trench floor. Another struck Jimmy's rifle, which he had foolishly propped against the trench wall, damaging the stock. Then Mac had an inspiration born of 3 days watching these snipers. He grabbed his helmet decoy and raised it quickly in an unusual position, directly between two previous shooting lanes where he had observed overlapping fields of fire. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then 2 shots rang out simultaneously from different positions, both aimed at the same helmet. The shots revealed exact muzzle flash locations. Mac dropped the helmet and immediately shouted coordinates to the radio man. Enemy positions at coordinates Baker 7 and Baker 9, requesting immediate fire mission. The radio man relayed the information rapidly. The artillery battery responded with impressive speed. Within 90 seconds, shells were falling on the new sniper positions. The jungle erupted once again with explosions. Mac had used the snipers' own aggression against them, forcing them to reveal positions they had carefully prepared. After the artillery ceased, silence returned to the jungle. Real silence this time. Minutes passed without any shots. Mac cautiously raised the helmet decoy from multiple positions. No response. He tried a mirror trick to reflect sunlight. Nothing. The snipers were either dead, wounded, or had finally exhausted their ammunition. Exactly 1,400 hours. The sound of engines announced the arrival of reinforcements. 2 trucks and a half-track appeared on the road behind the American position, carrying fresh soldiers, ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, relief from Mac's exhausted squad. Lieutenant Morrison was the first to greet the arriving commander, but he immediately pointed to Mac. This sergeant and his men held this position for 3 days against continuous sniper fire. They developed tactics that saved lives and provided intelligence for effective counter-battery fire. Mac felt his men gather around him: Jimmy, Rodriguez, Chun, and the others who had survived. They had done something important here, something that would be written in field reports and possibly taught to other units facing similar situations. They had turned a desperate defensive position into a tactical victory, using nothing but a helmet and a broomstick. The reinforcements brought more than supplies and fresh troops. They brought a specialized reconnaissance team trained to sweep areas for enemy survivors and document battlefield results. Mac volunteered to guide them, despite being exhausted from 3 days of constant stress. He needed to know if his strategy had actually worked or if he had just been lucky. The sweep began 2 hours after the reinforcements arrived, with a full platoon providing security while the recon team moved carefully through the jungle. Mac walked with them, pointing out the positions he had marked on his maps. The first location was 140 yards from the American trench line, hidden in a cluster of thick vegetation beneath a fallen tree. What they found confirmed Mac's tactical analysis. The position was expertly constructed, a shallow pit with overhead camouflage, sight lines carefully cut through the foliage, and a rest carved into the earth for stabilizing a rifle. Scattered around the position were 53 empty shell casings from an Arisaka rifle. 53 rounds fired from this single location. The Japanese sniper was gone, apparently having retreated after the artillery bombardment. But he had left behind evidence of his dedication. A small water container, empty ration tins, and a camouflage cloth indicated he had lived in this position for at least 3 days, perhaps longer. The second position told a more grim story. Here the artillery had found its target. The body of a Japanese soldier lay among shattered trees and torn earth, his rifle broken, his position completely destroyed. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, his uniform marked with the insignia of a veteran unit that had fought in China before being transferred to the Pacific. Mac felt no joy at the sight. War was killing, but he understood these men were soldiers following orders, fighting for their country just as he was. The sniper had been skilled and brave. In different circumstances, Mac might have respected him. In these circumstances, his death meant Mac's squad would live. The recon team counted 37 shell casings at this position. Combined with the first location, that was 90 rounds fired from just 2 sniper positions. As they moved to the third and fourth locations, the count continued to climb. One position yielded 28 casings. Another had 41. By the time they had checked all the documented sniper locations, the total exceeded 140 rounds of ammunition. But the most significant discovery came at the fifth position. Here they found a written log, surprisingly intact despite the artillery damage. The recon team's translator, a Japanese-American sergeant named Takashi Yamamoto, read the document carefully. His expression grew more solemn as he translated. "It's a diary," Yamamoto explained to Mac and the recon team leader. This sniper was keeping records of his shots. He notes 27 confirmed hits on helmets over 3 days. He writes that he suspects American deception, but cannot risk ignoring potential targets. He mentions ammunition concerns and expresses frustration that resupply has not arrived in 6 weeks. The diary entry from the final day was particularly revealing. The sniper wrote that he knew death was likely, but hoped his sacrifice would delay the American advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. He mentioned a younger brother in Hiroshima and his sister in Tokyo. The last line simply said he had done his duty. Mac took off his helmet for a moment, a gesture of respect for an enemy who had fought bravely and died far from home. War created these moments, recognition of shared humanity even across the divide of conflict that by the time they returned to the American lines, the full picture was clear. The Japanese had positioned between 8 and 10 snipers around the American position. They had fired approximately 150 rounds over 3 days, with at least 100 of those rounds directed at Mac's decoys. Only 17 bullets had actually struck the helmet itself. The rest had hit dirt, wood, air, and nothing. Lieutenant Morrison filed a detailed after-action report that evening. He recommended Mac for a Bronze Star for tactical innovation under combat conditions. The recommendation included a technical description of the decoy technique and suggested it be shared with other units facing similar situations in the Pacific Theater. Word of Mac's trick spread rapidly through the division. Within a week, other units were implementing similar tactics. Within a month, the technique appeared in a training bulletin distributed to Army units throughout the Pacific. Mac's simple idea, born of desperation and observation, became standard counter-sniper doctrine. 3 weeks after the incident, Mac received a letter from division headquarters. The Bronze Star recommendation had been approved. More significantly, he was being temporarily assigned to a training unit to teach the decoy technique to newly arrived soldiers. His experience would help save lives across the theater of operations. Jimmy found Mac that evening, sitting on his helmet and staring at the jungle that had nearly killed them all. The original bullet-riddled helmet sat beside him, a battered trophy of survival. "So we're famous now?" Jimmy said, sitting down next to his friend. "The guys who fooled the Japanese with a stick and a helmet." Mac smiled slightly. "We're alive. That's what matters. How'd you think of it anyway? I mean, really, what made you grab that broomstick?" Mac was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather fought in France in 1918. He told me stories when I was a kid. The trenches, the snipers, the way men found simple solutions to terrible problems. He said war strips everything down to basics. You survive by being smarter than the enemy, not necessarily stronger or braver. Your grandfather would be proud." "Maybe," Max said. He picked up the helmet and examined the 17 holes punched through the metal. 17 bullets that might have killed 17 men. 150 rounds that might have wounded or killed dozens more if the snipers had saved their ammunition for real targets. The Pacific War would continue for another year. Mac would see more battles, more islands, more death. But this moment, 3 days of terror turned into tactical victory through simple innovation, would stay with him forever. It would remind him that soldiers won wars not just with weapons and courage, but with intelligence and creativity. As the tropical sun set over the jungle, Mac made a decision. He would keep the helmet, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the old ways still worked, that simple solutions often beat complex ones, and that survival often depended on thinking differently than the enemy expected. He would carry it through the rest of the war, a battered piece of metal worth more than metals.